So we have 3 hours. I suggest that we take 2 breaks at least. So at the end of each hour, we can take a break. For those of you that were in my presentation in Berlin, this is going to be similar. In fact, I have an intro that is essentially the same as what I presented in Berlin, and then the same tutorials, but updated to the new API. So there's slightly some different changes, and the text has also been changed a little bit. But now we have more time. So hopefully we can go through most of the tutorials which I can go through again. And also there's more people that I know have been playing around with some of the tutorials. So hopefully you also have some questions so we can go into the details. Okay. Any questions, any doubt, just interrupt and ask me. I'm actually going to be running the code on Visual Studio Code, the Julia code on Visual Studio Code. So if there's any questions or anything that you want to test, we can also just write some code, improvise a bit. But yeah, the idea is to have a balance between the people who haven't used Julia, haven't used VPL, and the people who already have some experience and you want to ask some questions. Okay. And everything is recorded. And I am considering to upload it to YouTube because then it's easier for me to share it with everyone in the world. Otherwise, it's a bit hard to share. I mean, they can download the video from Microsoft Stream, but it's harder to share with people outside of the organization. So I'm considering to put it on YouTube, and it could be a private video that only people who have the link access, or make it public. That depends on how bad the video ends up being and how ashamed I am with myself. So we will see. Okay. So is there any questions from the start? I will try to keep the time in mind, but yeah, if people want to have a break at some point, we can have a break. Okay. Okay. So first little slides. Just to give an introduction of what is VPL and some of the ideas behind, what was my thought process building this, so that you have a better understanding of what I aim for. Okay. And then we can spend the rest of the time just running something. So sometimes I will say VPL, sometimes I will say the virtual plan laboratory. The Julia packages themselves have some restrictions about the naming, so you cannot have a 3-letter name for a package in principle, unless you negotiate with sort of the big bosses in the Julia community. So there is no package called VPL, it's called Virtual Plan Lab, but that's sort of the VPL package, okay? So what exactly is VPL? It's a collection of packages written in the Julia language. So there are 5 core packages that implement all the functionality, plus 1 package, which is the interface that sort of wraps everything. That is the package that you will interact with as a user, right? And that is a Virtual Plan Lab package that I will show you later. It is useful to know that there are internally all these packages, because sometimes you might need to access some functionality that maybe is not part of the public API, or you will need to do something that we call defining a method for a new type. So then you need to know in which package that method is located, right? And I will show you later how you do that. So what VPL offers, it's basically a collection of data structures and mostly functions, algorithms that help you build, simulate, and visualize FSP models, okay? Now, the development of VPL is driven by the needs of our research. And by that, I mean the people who are building FSP models within Wageningen, right? Of course, I work for CSA, so I'm much more familiar with what is happening in CSA, but I know that the stuff that's happening in FPP and now in FEM is also very similar. And that means covering both crops and also trees, right? Not just because of the work in FEM, but also because of the work that we're doing in CSA with tropical perennials. The kind of models that we work on are plant level models, where functionality is defined at the organ and plant level. And it's important to emphasize that because it's also people working on FSP modeling that also have models of anatomy, so we see cells, let's say, for the roots or for the leaves, right? So VPL does not address any of that. a lot of the emphasis or a lot of the models that I have in mind are models that look at plant-plant interactions or plant-environment interactions, which is kind of redundant because most plant-plant interactions happen in the environment. But that's basically where I think VPL will shine, right? In fact, at the moment, if you want to do very detailed physiological stuff, like looking at internal transfer of hormones, for example, their VPL is a little bit weaker than the attenuates, right? And as I said, the aim is to cover all kinds of cross systems. Okay, so I have a bunch of links for the presentation. So let's open the first one, virtualplantlab.com. That is the official website of the project that contains all the documentation. Here you have a little box that says version. And there you have version 0.02, stable and def. So basically, because this is a Julia package, you get releases which are linked to versions. So you're going to have version 0.02, 0.03, etc. Right? So you always have a documentation that corresponds to that version that has been registered in the Julia registry. So when you install the package, what you get is that version, right? So you can specify which version you want to install, basically, but normally you get the latest version, which is either stable or in this case 0.02, because that's the same. Def corresponds to the latest version on GitHub, right? So you can also, we'll show you also how to install the latest version on GitHub, which is still not released, which means that there might be some bugs, there might be some instabilities, okay? But then you get sort of the cutting edge, you know, the latest features that are available in VPL. So for example, if someone finds a bug and I fix it, it's going to go into the dev version, and I'm not necessarily going to release a new sort of stable version until, you know, I accumulate enough changes, because otherwise we soon will have like version 0.0, 120, something like that, right? And it is a bit of a hassle to get these releases accepted by sort of the Julia whole process. It's a bit of a headache. So what I recommend, especially if you're using more advanced stuff, is that you switch to the dev version when you look at the website, and then install the GitHub version of the project. And yeah, also that means there will be fewer typos and fewer errors in the documentation if you use the latest version. Okay, so a bit about the website. So there's a little introduction where I describe more or less what is in the presentation that I'm giving today, and also how to install the Virtual Pilot Lab. Then you have this section manual, and there's a little tutorial about Julia. Don't take this as sort of a first introduction to Julia. I assume that you already have some knowledge of Julia, but this is highlighting those things that are particularly important for working with VPL. Okay, because you can get, let's say, you can do an introductory course online to Julia that focuses on data analysis, for example. That's quite common. And you might not cover certain concepts that you actually need to know to use VPL effectively, right? So here I sort of have a collection of all the things that are relevant when using VPL from the Julia side, okay? And then there's a few articles that I need to update actually, which are describing, let's say, the theory behind, a little bit of the theory behind how VPL works, so explaining how the graphs works, the queries, the rules, you know, the different geometry primitives that exist in the language, so in VPL, how the turtle works when you generate geometry. So it's a little bit of a high-level description of the different features in VPL. We're currently writing a paper on VPL that hopefully will be soon published in Silico Plans that basically has a summarized version of this. So you can see this as an expansion of the first half of that paper where I describe all the features, okay? Then we have what I think is the most useful part, and this is what I'm going to cover today, tutorials. So I have a few tutorials that are sort of loose, addressing different topics. So first I have a very simple tutorial describing linear growth of an algae, you know, multicellular algae. So this is sort of your first introduction to writing graphs in VPL. Then I have the snowflake example, which is a ripoff from Groin, basically. But then I show you how you can do more interesting snowflakes by changing the axioms and the rules. So this is your first introduction to how to do the geometry part of VPL. And then I have a series of tutorials, and that's where I'm going to spend most of the time today, that start by building a tree. So a single tree with very descriptive rules, and then slowly start adding more and more functionality, right? So from a tree, we go to forest. Then there's actually growth in the forest, meaning that you actually have sink sources, relative growth rate. Then that growth rate is driven by radiation efficiency. So we also add the light sources in the next tutorial. And then there's a final tutorial where we calculate photosynthesis. So by following those tutorials, you will slowly build up a relatively sophisticated functional structure plan model. And you can use that as a sort of a starting point to sort of wrap your mind around how would I migrate from growing to VPL, for example, right? How do I implement the different organs and different types and so on. And then there's a couple of more advanced tutorials that are addressing very specific things. So this one, relational queries, it's basically based on an exercise that we usually have in the growing workshop where you have a very complex graph and then you need to write very complicated queries to identify specific nodes, right? And that's all based on the relationship between the nodes. So here I show you how to do the VPL, so you can learn all the ins and outs of, relational queries in VPL. There's a lot more tutorials that I'm writing, but they're not on the website yet. So these lists will grow up over time. Okay. Then on the website, we also have the API. So the API contains all the functions with the documentation that you can actually call in VPL. Right. So when you're going through tutorials, and let's say you have, I don't know, you find there's a function called rewrite. My keyboard is not connecting. You write rewrite on the search bar, and then it will show you everywhere in the website where rewrite is written, right? And if you click here, you get the documentation for the rewrite function, right? And it tells you what it does, and there's always, or usually there's an example at the end of the documentation for each function that you can run and play around to get an idea of how it works, right? So all the functions, all the data structure, all the types that you can interact with, let's say exported, so they're publicly available, they're all documented on the website, right? And you can just use the search bar to find them. Okay. And then we also have, well, let's go back to the presentation. I will show you the GitHub later, because I want to talk about what is the VPL verse. So VPL, as I said before, are 4 core packages plus the interface. Okay, VPL verse, sort of the VPL universe, are all the packages that are related to VPL or that work with VPL because they're being developed by the same people, basically by me or by Rami Tessi in Montpellier. And they're part of the same GitHub organization, actually. So these are packages that will be helpful when you're actually building an FSP model, especially when it comes to the functionality. Right, so we have a package that used to be called Sky, so now it's called Sky Domes because of the rules of package naming in Julia. And this is to create a dome of light sources when you want to simulate solar radiation. So all the stuff related to solar radiation, distribution of diffuse light in the sky and all the stuff, it's done for you in the Sky Domes. So you don't have to copy paste, this big chunk of code that no one really understood. Then we have the Cofis, which at the moment has mostly functions for photosynthesis, but the idea is that in the future we will add more and more of the usual stuff that we use, although temperature response curves, maybe some beta distributions that we use for simulating sink strength. So these kind of little models that you always use in FSPM, I want to collect them in one package, document them so that people also don't have to copy paste all this code, and we can properly test all those models. So that way, yeah.
So in this case, for example, if you think about photosynthesis or something, it's a new function that you will call photosynthesis.
Yeah, stuff like that, yeah.
And then you install the Ecofis, and then in your own VPL package, you just use this function.
Yeah, so in your own model,
So you don't,
in your own model, you use the function or that object from Ecofis to build the photosynthesis model, and then you can assign the parameter values.
So it's the same as like in R that you have like packages, blah, 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 and you have to.
It's exactly the same philosophy as R. This works exactly as an R. You install the package, you load it in your script, and then you can use the functionality.
But there's also, because also these are, because I can imagine that outside of these, so in the other ones, there are also already functions written, right? Or not? So what is the difference between combining certain functions in these certain packages compared to just putting all the packages in one VPL? Like,
why is not everything in one package? That's mostly for the developers, because VPL used to be one package. So actually, this 4 packages plus package interface used to be one. And then it became really hard for me to basically keep improving it and managing it, because there's many different things. It was a huge package. So there's practical consideration from the development side. From the user point of view, it's actually easier if everything is in one package.
Yeah, exactly.
From the developer point of view, it's much harder, especially as more and more people start to get involved in VPL. They can work on the ray tracer, for example, and they don't have to worry about anything else in VPL, right? Whereas if it's one package and they work in the ray tracer, they have to take into account that there's other code in the package that they cannot break.
So what if you have, for example, because that's R happens a lot, that in one package they use LM as a function doing this, and in another package they use the same code.
I will show you how to deal with that.
Okay.
Specifically, there's a thing called node in VPL that you need to, let's say, inherit from. And that's basically to create your own types of nodes. But in your model, you may have a type called node, which is the node in a branch. Yeah. So I will show you how you can avoid this naming issue.
Double naming, okay.
Because it happened to me when I was writing the tutorials, right? But yeah. But I will show you how to type in tutorial.
One other question, you can, of course, also make your own photosynthesis routine if you like to. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So basically, the idea is that Ecofis will evolve over time as a process of standardizing what people are already using. So people using the Farquhar model, for example, or the non-rectangular hyperbola across models. Yeah. And then one day we'll say, okay, guys, can you send me your code so that I can see what people are using? And I'm going to implement Ecofis so that we are all using exactly the same version, or more or less the same version, and it's documented, tested, etc.
Yeah, better.
So it will grow organically based on what people actually need. All the tutorials that are on the website or in the workshops, I try to put them in their own repository as code, so you can also just run them, so you don't have to, look for where they are in the website. And then there's 2 packages that I'm not going to talk much about because these are actually Remy's packages. So Plancy Engine, Plan by Physics. Plan by Physics at the moment is mostly for modeling photosynthesis, transpiration, and energy balance in a way that's a bit more modular and efficient than what we have in Ecofis, but it's also a bit more complex. And Plancy Engine is a general package for dealing with coupling different models and dealing with integration over time. Right? But at the moment, they're not fully compatible with VPL or not fully integrated. We still need to do some tests. But the idea is that in the future, we will integrate these packages in our own workflows when building advanced structural models. But that will come in the future. So a few clarifications about what I don't want to do with VPL. So I don't try to re-implement existing FSPM software, right? So this is not a re-implementation of Drawing or OpenAlia or any other FSPM software. Although, of course, in many cases, it achieves the same thing because we're still building the same models, right? But there will be differences in how you write your code and how the features work, right? It's important to understand that you are migrating, if you use VPL, you are migrating to a different software that is designed in a different way. You should still be able to build the same model, hopefully, but you might need to rethink a few things. I also don't want to have a modeling language. And that is a specific reference to how in most FSP modeling software, you have either L systems or growth grammars that are very abstract, and you have this sort of string of symbols, and there's a lot of. That's not what VPL aims to. So you will see that most of the time you're just defining functions and methods, and it's very procedural. So you're going to write a lot of for loops and if statements and less abstract mathematical syntax. And there's a big point of departure. Also to clarify, because there's some FSPM software out there that is really just a big model with lots of plugins, like I'm thinking of CPlumBox, for example. It's just a model that is very flexible. That's not the aim of VPL, right? In fact, technically there is no model shipped with VPL. So in that sense, it's a bit more similar to Groim, for example. And it's also not a standalone modeling platform or modeling studio. It's 100% written in Julia, and most of the questions that you will have, most of your doubts will be about Julia and not about VPL. As if you want to know, how do I plot the leaf area of my different plants? That's a Julia question. Anything that works in Julia, you can do it, right? Or how do I import a CSV file with some data from the field? Again, that's another task, it's a Julia task. So VPL only takes care of the things that are very, very specific about FSPM. Basically the geometry, the graph, and the rendering and the ray tracing, that's it. Okay?
So is it independent of it being a standalone modeling platform or not? I mean, in Groim, you still need to know Java.
Yeah, but for example, in Groim, you have one way to make a histogram or do a scatter plot, right? Which is actively supported by the people who develop Groim. I don't even try to do that, right? Like I give you, let's say, a data frame, and how you plot it is totally up to you, right? And
I'm responding the way you wrote this down. You need to learn Julia. To me, it's not connected to the fact that it's not going to be a standalone modeling platform.
okay,
That's what
fair
I
enough. Yeah. Good. And well, this is just a rationale as why I didn't want to make a standalone studio, standalone platform, and basically it's because we get a lot for free if we just have a pure Julia solution, right? Because all of this stuff I don't have to take care about, right? Like anywhere you can run Julia, you can run VPL. And that means in the cloud, that means in HPC service, you know, your Linux laptop. If you can run Julia on your phone, then you can run VPL on your phone, you know. Also, a lot of the 3D stuff, it's outsourced to an existing package, okay? Typical questions, you know, where do I write my VPL code? Where do I run VPL? Anywhere where you can run Julia. So that could be in VS Code, which is the tool that I recommend, but it could be a Jupyter notebook. It could be just a notepad and you copy paste in the terminal. Again, anywhere where you can run Julia, okay? And why not a modeling language? So this was a big decision, and this has to do especially with the queries and rules that we will discuss later. The nice thing about these domain-specific languages that I see in, you know, for L systems and for relational growth grammars is that they are very compact, they're very powerful, and also you focus on describing what you want and not so much how to achieve that, right? So the program is generating the code for you. Code is actually generated, that is actually run. That is also the disadvantage, right? Because if there is a problem with, let's say, a query or a rule, it's very hard to debug it because you don't actually have access to the code that is being executed. You have access to a high-level description, right? Also, the syntax can be a bit hard for people to learn at the beginning, right? So the difference here is that you need to learn a series of methods, for example, to traverse the graph. And the tutorials are there to help you. You know, how do you check which type of node does this node have as a parent? Then there's a method to retrieve the parent node, and then you check the type. So it's a little bit more like writing code in R, where you need to figure out the steps, and then you just lay out the steps. But now you're in control of the code that actually gets executed. So if there is a mistake, it's easier to just put a print statement halfway through your code to see, okay, what is happening at this step, for example, right? But again, for people who are very familiar with the languages that have been using FSPM, this might seem a little bit limiting, right? Because it's going to take you a while to get used to the new approach. I think for the people who are starting from scratch, I hope that it's actually easier than learning all the complicated syntax. And finally, some motivation. Why did I decide to build VPL? Which is partly what I would like to have as a user, but also what I would like to have as a more advanced modeler or developer. So as a user, I always wanted to have an FSPM platform that I could integrate in some kind of reproducible workflow. So I'm used to working in R, where I can write a series of scripts that do all the data analysis from the raw data up to the final figures. And I can just click a button and it redoes everything, right? And then I'm very confident that I know exactly how I got to some results, right? And I could never integrate the FSPM platforms I was working with into that workflow, right? Because it's a separate thing. I also always find it very hard to look into the source code and extend it. Let's say that we want to have a new material for the ray tracer or a new type of light source, or we want to have a new type of turtle operation, like to simulate gravitropism, or I want to modify the existing function for gravitropism. You will see that that is much easier to do with VPL. In fact, that has happened in the last year, that people will write their own code in their own script, and it will run even though they were not touching the source code. So I will try to illustrate. If we have time, I can try to illustrate that. And then I wanted to make sure that it runs anywhere, because in the past we had problems trying to write it on an HPC cloud. I don't want to have dependencies on things like Java, virtual machines, and I also wanted to make sure that the documentation and the source code was written in such a way that people could at least hope to be able to read it and modify it, right? As a developer or advanced modeler, personally, I wanted to understand exactly how these FSPM complex algorithms work. I was very frustrated with the ray tracer because I never understood exactly, and with the grid cloner, because I never understood exactly how it works. So by building it myself, now I understand exactly how it works. And now I have full control over everything in VPL, which means that it becomes much easier to add new features, right? And another thing that I wanted is to, by understanding exactly how everything FSPM works, move towards hybrid models. So this is basically dealing with situations where FSPM is no longer feasible. I see that a lot in tree modeling, where we start cutting corners because computation is just not feasible to, resolve line interception the way we want to, the way we would do it in nanocrop, right? But there's a lot of people working in tree modeling that don't have this level of detail, right? Like this leaf level ray tracing simulation. So how to come up with, let's say, hybrid solutions that don't fit neither the canonical FSPM nor the canonical Chrome model, just have something in between. With the tools that we have available, that's not possible right now. I hope that with VPL, we can start to rethink a little bit about, well, do we always want to go for, sort of a canonical FSPM or a canonical Chrome model? Can we have something that could be very useful for the more complicated advanced modeling that we do, whether it's trees or whether it's the root systems with the 3D soil simulation, right? All these situations where we find ourselves very limiting. By having more flexibility and control, maybe we can think out of the box new ways to address this kind of models. Okay. Okay. So Julia. What is Julia? I think everyone here have heard of Julia by now. It is a compiled language. That means that you're going to get the speed that you normally expect from languages like C, C++, Fortran. So these are like the fastest languages that we have. But at the same time, it is very dynamic and it's sort of compiled on demand, which means that when you're typing Julia code and you're interacting with the Julia console, it feels almost as dynamic as if you were using R or Python. It's not entirely true at the beginning, so there's a few sticky points, but it's pretty close to the feeling that you have with R and Python. Okay. I do have to say one thing is that if you write code, you can write code in Julia that runs and it produces the correct results, but that will not be the optimal in terms of performance. So if you actually want it to run as fast as possible, you do need to learn a little bit more about what makes Julia fast, but it's usually a matter of making small tweaks to the code and adding some type annotations, and then you get the maximum speed, right? So compared to what is normally done in Python and R, which is you prototype the code in R or Python, and if you want maximum speed, you need to translate it to C++. And that's where most people stop because they're going to do it, right? So it's much easier to get to the really fast code while staying within Julia. Okay, but I want to emphasize that the code that you write on the first attempt is not necessarily the fastest. Okay? But there's a lot of stuff about here. So yeah, so it's just easy to learn and to write code as if you were dealing with these classic dynamic languages, but you don't have the two language problem, right? So you don't need to translate it to C, C++, or Fortran. That's basically it. Okay. Another thing that I have to say, at the moment, Julia is getting better at things like data visualization and data analysis, but currently is not a substitute for R, especially in terms of productivity if you're used to deal with data in R. And so I don't necessarily recommend that people fully commit to Julia when they're doing FSPM and do everything in Julia. I think at the beginning it might be easier if you just focus on simulations. And there are ways to connect R and Julia, so you can call Julia from R, okay, and vice versa. But that also depends on the stage where you are, right? Like if you're at the beginning of your PhD, you might say, well, I want to learn how to do everything in Julia. But it might be a little bit more frustrating than doing it in R. Partly because there's less documentation, there's fewer examples, there's fewer people using Julia. Okay, so don't sort of jump into the Julia pool thinking, okay, in 1 month I'm going to be able to do everything that I was doing in growing an R, because then you might get a bit overwhelmed and you get frustrated and say, okay, then screw this Julia thing, I'm going to R. So be a little bit realistic, right? But it also depends the stage where you are in your project, right? And then a few words about the VPL design finally. So this is an overview of the core packages. Okay, so as I said, there are 5 core packages, and it's not very important that you understand these details, but it's good to have in your mind if you ever want to look at source code or to look at where is a function defined, that it's going to be in different locations in different packages. Okay. So applying graphs is a package that implements everything involving graphs. So that is the creation of graphs, rules, and queries. Okay. Then geometry is split into 2 packages. So all the geometry primitives are in the plan geom primitives. So that's where you create where the scenes are defined and where things like ellipses and cones and frustums and these kind of things are all defined there. Okay. All the stuff related to the turtle, like the rotations, the RU, RA operators, and everything has to do with the turtle is in its own package, the Plangian turtle. Okay. Then the visualization is in plan vis, but actually there's not much to see here because all the 3D stuff is handled by another Julia package. There you can write Nike. Okay. And finally, the ray tracer is in the plan ray tracer. So if you ever want to learn how a ray tracer actually works internally, or you have any doubts, that's in the plan ray tracer. But again, I think most of the time the documentation should suffice. And there's only one package that you need to be aware of, but you will see in the tutorials when actually, I don't think that's even needed. No. Anyway, most of the time you don't need to know this. but it's just sort of keeping your mind if you ever want to look at source code. You first need to know which package is it actually containing. And here I have a bit more theory, and after that we can have a break and start writing some code. How do the graphs work in VPL? So the idea is that the graphs that I have here are really the kind of graphs that you could write with L systems, basically. So these are what are called tree graphs. So you have a node that can have children, right? Those nodes can themselves have children, descendants. There are no cycles. I don't think anyone has ever used them in FSPN, but okay, I have to say that. In these graphs, each node can store any data that you want to, right? So you create your own types. So these are like classes in Java. Okay, they need to inherit from node, right? Because that allows you to know that this is something you want to store inside a graph, right? It doesn't give it any special fields or not many methods, right? But basically, you will see in the tutorials that when I define an internode, when I define a leaf, when I define stem, I always add this piece of code at the beginning to say, okay, this is something I'm going to store inside a graph, inside a node.
So if you say I define a stem, for example, which is, a cylinder, visualize as a cylinder, but it has all these functions.
Yeah.
It's also a node. Do you call?
Yeah, so this is not a botanical node. So graphs have nodes.
But so that's just the blocks that are represented by the arrows. If I
Yes,
visualize
so
the
these are
GrowImp,
the dots,
graph.
and this arrow is connecting the dots.
Yeah.
Right, and this is describing the topological relationship.
Yeah.
Of the different parts of the plant.
So every dot you call
Yeah.
the node.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's these nodes. Yeah.
So very simply in GrowImp we often have like plant base, and then in plant base we have. That's also in the graph. It's
So
also
plant base will be a
square.
node.
That's also
Yes.
a
Yes.
node. Okay. Yeah.
Leaf will be a
And
node.
then-
Sometimes you have turtle operators,
which are also nodes.
which
Yeah.
are also nodes because you want to rotate the turtle.
Yeah. Okay.
So everything that you put in the graph, every little circle is a node. And then inside the data type, you can store any data that you want, right? So normally, most of the time, this refers to an organ. So you're going to store things that you want to keep track of inside an organ. And then you will define a method. So this is important. This feed method is the one method that you need to define for the particular type. I will show you examples in the tutorial. And that's where you're going to define the geometry. So cylinder, also the material. So that's for the ray tracer. So usually it's going to be a Lambertian material, and you specify the optical properties, but also the color, so that when you render it, you can choose, well, I want my cylinders to be yellow or green. So I will show you examples of that.
The color doesn't determine the optical properties.
No, so this is separate. So color refers for the visualization, right? And the material refers to the ray tracer.
Yeah.
That's in the GrowImp also.
Yes.
Switch here.
Yeah. Right. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Interesting.
And one difference that you will see, well, I don't know if we will get there. I'm not sure if I have in the tutorial, but because this is all procedural, you can have different materials and different colors for the same organ. And you can decide during the simulation, okay, I want to use this material and this color now. Later, I want to use a different material or different color. So you can actually visualize the same scene with different color schemes without having to rewrite your code. Right. And
Can you also determine the inner material property? In GrowImp, you can say IOR or something. Like I want to simulate glass
yeah,
that has a certain contents inside that determines the breaking of the wave.
so at the moment, the materials you can specify. So there's several materials predefined.
Yeah.
But those are assumed to be like sort of infinitesimal slabs. So there's a transmittance, reflectance, and then there's a way to determine the angle.
Okay,
in which
well,
the array
would be enough, I think. Yeah.
So I have Phong, I have Lambertian, and then I have special materials like sensor, which is like the one in GrowImp, and also black material that absorbs all the light.
Yeah.
But it's also relatively easy. I haven't documented yet, but you can define your own material in your own script. You just need to create a new data type and then define 2 or 3 methods, and that would work as if it was written in VPL.
Yeah.
The only aspect of VPL that feels a little bit like a language, like a little bit of syntax, is how you actually create the graphs, right? Because I found that doing that procedurally is really cumbersome. So what you see here is an example of creating a phytomer. So you have a node. In this case, this is a botanical node, not the graph node. And that is followed by a lateral bud, a leaf, an internode, and then the apical nerve stem. Okay, so that's a classical nerve stem with one leaf and one axillary bud. So each of these statements is actually creating an object. So you will have defined a type or class. You can call it class, but in Julia they're called type. Called node, type called bud, type called leaf, and this is basically the constructor, right? So it's creating the object, constructing the object. When you add this object, it's basically adding them sequentially in the graph, right? So this becomes the children of node. Meristem is the child of internode, right? So the plus is just adding, sort of defining a parent to child relationship in the graph. Okay. When you have this parenthesis, this brackets, is to have multiple children added to the same node, right? So effectively here you will have a node that has 3 children, bud, leaf, and internode. And then the internode have a child, which is meristem. Right? So there is one path that connects node, internode, meristem. That's the main branch. And then there's 2 nodes that branch out, the bud and the leaf. And you can see that in the future, this bud will become its own phytomer.
So if you replace the plus between leaf and internode with a comma and do the closing parenthesis after meristem, you get the same.
If you do the parentheses were here.
No, so the parenthesis close after meristem, and then after leaf you replace the plus with a comma. Would that be the same resulting code?
Yes.
No, because meristem is coming from
No. So what he
directly from
means,
node and not from internode.
no. So what he means is put the comma here.
Yeah.
And move this parenthesis here.
Yes.
If this is the total graph,
Yeah.
then yes,
Yeah.
it will be equivalent. Yes. So there's a technical theme, which is what I call the insertion point.
Yeah.
So the insertion point is not modified by the parentheses.
Yeah.
So when I add the button leaf, the insertion point is still node.
Yeah. Okay.
But since you're not inserting anything else,
Yeah.
you will get the same
Okay.
result.
Cool. Thanks.
But we can test it. Now, we don't normally work with static graphs, right? We normally want to evolve them over time. So there's going to be 2 things that you're going to use to interact with the graphs: rules and queries. They're going to be very similar. The difference that a rule is going to replace nodes by something else. And that could be a new node, a new subgraph, so a collection of nodes, or nothing, in which case you're sort of pruning the graph, presumably cloning the parent. Okay. Queries, you don't replace the nodes, you just extract the nodes in an array so you can modify the content of the nodes. Right? So when you want to modify the data stored in the nodes, you use queries. When you want to replace the nodes to represent senescence or development, then you use rules. But otherwise, the code you're going to write is very similar. Okay? And something that people like a lot is that you can have different graphs defined for different plants, and you can do all these rules and queries in parallel. Right? So you don't have one graph for your entire simulation. You can have separate graphs for different plants. Okay. About the geometry, basically you will be creating a scene that contains all the 3D geometry in your model. And this is always based on triangular meshes. So everything in the end is just a triangular mesh. That means that when you have cylinders or spheres or ellipses, you're making an approximation, right? Because I need to turn into a triangular mesh. In those meshes, you can add colors if you want to visualize it, otherwise you will get an error. And you can add materials if you want to use a ray tracer. Okay. And those scenes are created from graphs using this feed function that I told you. It's also possible to create these 3D elements, let's say manually, so without having a graph. So you can always create a cylinder, prism. You can rotate it, translate it, scale it, and then add it to the mesh, to the scene, sorry, right? So you can have triangle meshes that are generated from the graph, represent the plants, but you can also, let's say, the structure of a greenhouse, for example, you can create it separately and just merge it with the scenes created from the plants, right? So that doesn't have to be in a graph. And you can import and export meshes from the 3 most common file format, which are OBJ, STL, and PLY, right? So for example, if you create a triangle mesh for a leaf in some external software, and you save it in one of these formats, and this is basically just going to define the vertices and the triangles that connect the vertices, you can import that into VPL, and then you can use that mesh in your graphs, and you can still rotate it, scale it, etc. Right?
That also means that when you run the ray tracer, you can get the absorbed light for each of the triangles automatically.
Yes. So yeah, it's a little bit more advanced, but we're actually doing that for the paper. You can define one material. So when you call the feed function, you're creating a geometric primitive, right? And that could be a mesh that you imported, or it could be a cylinder, sphere, whatever. And that will have a number of triangles. So you can define one material for all the triangles that is shared for all the triangles. So then it will collect the absorbed power for all the triangles, or you can define as many materials as triangles. And then each triangle will get its own absorbed power. And you can also calculate the area of each triangle. So you can integrate in space more easily. So in the paper, we will have an example of how to do that.
Why would you want to do that?
For example, for photosynthesis, it matters because you can have a lot of spatial heterogeneity in the light. And sometimes leaves can be quite big. If it's a cereal, the blade of a cereal can actually span most of the canopy. Right? So the proper way to compute photosynthesis will be to look at locally and then add them up rather than using the average part.
But then you still have the whole leaf created from the same material, or then you also say within the leaf you distribute the N and therefore the.
You could have a nitrogen profile. I mean, you can have different materials just to keep the absorbed parts separately. But you could also change the optical properties within the leaf. That's also possible. But I haven't done it. So it might be a little bit hard because you need to know where is the position of each triangle and then feed that into your profile function, but it might be possible. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it sounds like a sort of automatic segmentation, because we have, of course, 3D scans of plants, but they contain leaves, stems, fruit.
Yeah.
They're going to segment the fruits out because they have a different texture.
Well, so it's not automatic segmentation in the sense that either you import the mesh that's already been segmented, or you're using one of the primitives, like a sphere or an ellipsoid or something like that, which will have some standard. I actually keep saying sphere, but right now I don't have the meshing for the sphere. But most primitives will have a standard algorithm for doing the segmentation. Yeah. But yeah.
but because I was thinking, like, now, if we want to have a variation, then we often say, okay, we do the nitrogen level that is varied across the light, and therefore you have higher photosynthesis, but we never actually change the absorbance with nitrogen, right?
Yeah.
And that's not possible in growing, but you say that you could in theory do that. That you also say, like, if nitrogen is higher and therefore we assume more chlorophyll and therefore absorbance should be higher, then actually your optical property could also be adjusted based on the distribution.
Well, the leaf
And
ages and it gets a different color. It gets more brownish and so on. It's very nice that you can now do that.
So
No, but then it should. But then
so there could be different ways to
be a
do this.
flexible input, right? Then feed should also be dynamic and not fixed based on the.
Yes.
Right.
So there's different ways to do it. One is that you build, let's say we're talking about a serial blade. You could actually build it as rectangles or technically quadrilateral. So you're stacking them. And you could do that Because you also want to have some curvature, so you actually need to have multiple calls to feed, right?
Yeah.
And looking at David because he has implemented that, right? So you will have multiple calls. We're not going to see that in the tutorials because I'm not such a complicated piece, but you will have multiple. You have like a for loop where you're making different calls to feed, and you're also rotating the turtle to simulate the curve. So you're assigning different materials, and in this way you can keep track of the position within the blade. It will be much harder to keep track of the absolute positions, but at least you can have the relative position within the blade.
But in this case, do all
And then
the,
you can have
because all the triangle or the different parallel
grams.
grams
Yeah.
are not different nodes.
No, but it doesn't matter. The geometry. So
Yeah, but if you want to make it functional,
let's wait for the tutorials. Because the geometry doesn't have to be a node in the graph, but you have access to the data stored in your node. So there you can have all the information that you need to create profiles.
So in the node itself, you can say my leaf consists of actually 5 segments.
Yes.
And all these 5 segments are separately have different
Chlorophyll content.
properties.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yes.
Because that's
That
in
already
growing
is in
different
growing.
nodes, right?
It's really good.
That's what we did with
That's
different
really,
nodes. That I did with the stick.
Which you are not,
I had to
said
do
you
that,
are
otherwise I
not
couldn't be.
able to ask for absolute.
I haven't tried. Because the way turtle graphics work is that the turtle has an absolute state. So you know the coordinates of the turtle in your absolute coordinate system. But then the logic for adding the geometry is always local. But there should be a way to figure out the absolute coordinate, or at least the absolute height. I'm just saying I haven't tested it.
Okay.
So there might be some unexpected difficulties, but I think it should be possible. So that you can have a profile defined on distance from the ground, right? Like an exponential profile of nitrogen. So it's not determined on the relative position within the leaf, but the relative position within the canopy. Right? That should be possible, but I haven't tested.
Also for light, it's useful when you want to know the profile
Yeah.
of the light extinction. Then
Yeah.
you ask for the absolute position of each of your triangles, let's say, in the
Yeah.
plan, and then you can plot it.
Yes.
But then you need the absolute.
Yes. Yes, you're right. If you want to do a profile of absorbed light. Yes. But I think with the tutorials, it will become clear what's the relation between the graph and the geometry. So for visualization, you can see the graphs as what I call network diagrams. This is like what you have in drawing, so circles for nodes and then the arrows. And you can customize the labels, because at the moment by default it will just show the type of node and then an ID, and that's like a unique identifier for the node. You can extract the node from the graph with that ID. But maybe you want to have a more different way of visualizing the nodes. So, and I plan to add more customization so that you can change colors, you can change shapes, so that you can use the graph to help you interpret actually what you see. It is interactive in the sense that you can zoom in, zoom out, and pan. In my experience, this is useful at a point. The moment that you have like 1,000 nodes, the graph is no longer very useful, to be honest. Okay. Then we have the 3D rendering, which of course is what people care about. These are all handled by Mackie. So a lot of the questions that you might have about, can I do an animation? Can I change the light settings? Can I change the camera? My answer will be look into Mackie, because basically I create sort of an object that package handles to do the 3D rendering. And it supports multiple backends. The two that are most useful that I've tested is OpenGL and WebGL. So OpenGL is basically when you're running locally on your machine. WebGL is when you're running on, let's say, a Jupyter notebook or some kind of interactive environment on the web. So this could be useful if we run remotely the code, right? If you run remotely, like in Wageningen, the Anuna server, so the HPC server, you can have a Jupyter notebook where the code is running on the server, but you see the results on your laptop on a browser, right? So in that case, you would want to use WebGL. to do the rendering of the figures. But you also have an option to, run your simulations without any rendering. And that's what you would do when you want to run a bunch of simulations in a remote server that doesn't have support for 3D graphics. That's also possible. Okay. And you can export snapshots and so on. At the moment, there's no way to have like a fancy ray trace, beautiful view of your field. And I also don't. And I also, even though there is a grid cloner for the ray tracer, you kind of visualize it in the 3D rendering, right? There is a ray tracer for visualization bit added to Mackie, but I'm waiting for it to actually work.
Is it going to happen by itself, or does it need someone doing the work?
Yeah, someone will have to do it, but I think they have funding now to do that. But yeah, that's not implemented because at the moment focus more on the functionality and not on the eye candy. So it's, you need to have someone else work with a VPL to get that. The ray tracer, yeah, it's a stochastic ray tracer, multi-threaded, multi-wavelength. You can have as many wavelengths or wavelengths as you want simultaneously. And I don't make any assumptions about what you're simulating. It could be RGB and infrared, or it could be any ad hoc combination of wavelengths. Basically, the ray tracer is agnostic with respect to that. It's also agnostic with respect to the units. So it could be micromoles per square meter per second. It could be watts per square meter, whatever you want. The package Sky Domes helps you set up all the light sources for Sky, and also handles all the calculations for solar radiation and conversions between the most common wavelengths. Okay, but you don't have to use that. You can do whatever you want. There are some light sources and materials already implemented, but I also made it in a modular way so that you can add your own light sources and your own materials. And basically, a light source is combined of a geometry and an angular distribution. So you could have a point with some ad hoc angular distribution, and I know that this is important for people working with LEDs, for example, because LEDs have like very specific angular distributions, right? It has some basic features like, okay, it's not as slow as it could be, but it's also not as fast as it could be. So we need to look into the performance of the ray tracer, but it's not crazily slow, at least algorithmically. The implementation maybe needs to be improved a little bit. And it has, the famous or infamous grid cloner. And if we have times later, I can explain a little bit how it works, because I don't know if it's exactly the same as in Groimp. I suspect it might be slightly different, but I don't know exactly how it works in Groimp. So I can only explain how it works in VPL. Okay. And one interesting thing is that you can have multiple ray tracers in the same model. And that means you could run the ray tracer multiple times within a day. So you could do that to calculate light at different times of the day. You integrate all the processes and then you do the graph rewriting. Okay, so the ray tracer is completely decoupled from graph rewriting. Triggering the ray tracer does not trigger the rules of the graph or the queries. But also, even though you can simulate multiple wavelengths, it might be more optimal to have different ray tracers for different wavelengths if the optical properties are very different. So my hypothesis is simulating PAR and far right at the same time. Maybe you're being too inefficient when you're simulating the PAR, for example.
You mean that for far red, you need more bounces than for PAR?
Yes,
Perhaps,
yeah.
and that's a ray tracer setting.
Yeah, that's a ray tracer setting. So it could be, again, I haven't tested this, but it could be that having several ray tracers for PAR and far red may be more efficient, because the way multi-wavelengths are handled, it adds variance to the calculations. So it is correct in the sense that the results are not biased, but you're going to get a lot more variation because it needs to accommodate for the different optical properties of the different wavelengths. But again, these are just things that you can do with VPL, and we need to figure out what is the optimal way. So at least we can do it. Yeah, so that was the general overview. I suggest that we have a break now because it was a lot of talking from me. And after these, we'll go through tutorials and hopefully the details.